It's February 27, 1943, 1 a.m. Above the mountains of southern Norway, 6 shadows slip silently through a white blizzard. Each carries 25 kilograms of explosives, a Sten gun, and cyanide pills. Because if they're caught, Hitler's men won't take prisoners. Their target is not a fortress, not a convoy, but a factory perched on a cliff, the Vemork hydroelectric plant, 100 miles west of Oslo. To the Germans, it's a harmless industrial site, producing fertilizer and hydrogen. But inside one windowless hall, behind concrete and steel pipes, runs a secret that could rewrite the entire war. Heavy water. 2 atoms of deuterium, 1 of oxygen. The only known substance that can make a uranium chain reaction stable enough to build a nuclear reactor. And that reactor, if it ever runs, could give Nazi Germany the atomic bomb. British intelligence is terrified. The Allies are months behind in fissile material. If Hitler's physicists succeed, the war for Europe is already lost. So London issues an order to Norway's underground resistance and the Special Operations Executive: destroy the heavy water facility at Vemork, at any cost. But here's the twist. This isn't the first time they've tried. Just 3 months earlier, a British glider mission called Operation Freshman ended in fire and death. 2 planes crashed. All survivors were executed under Hitler's commando order. The Germans fortified the site. Landmines, floodlights, extra guards, attack dogs. So what you're about to hear is the second attempt. A mission so dangerous that planners in London estimated 0 survival chance. And yet, the men who volunteered were all Norwegian. Skiers, saboteurs, hunted patriots. Their leader, Joachim Roneberg, was only 23 years old. He would later recall, "It was not heroism. It was necessity. We knew what would happen if we failed." Tonight, we unpack the untold story of how those men, armed with skis, wire cutters, and sheer will, slipped through Hitler's defenses, crawled into a hydro plant, and planted explosives that shattered Germany's nuclear dream. This is Operation Gunnerside, the night Hitler's bomb died in the snow. To understand why a handful of Norwegians risked their lives for one factory, you need to understand the science behind it. In December 1938, 2 German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, accidentally split a uranium atom. That discovery, nuclear fission, released unimaginable energy. Across Europe, physicists realized whoever controlled this reaction could create a weapon 1,000,000 times more powerful than TNT. Hitler's regime immediately took notice. Germany had top scientists, advanced industry, and by 1939 had begun forming a secret initiative, the Uranverein, or Uranium Club. The goal? Build a self-sustaining nuclear reactor to breed plutonium and eventually a bomb. But there was a problem. To sustain a chain reaction, neutrons released from fission must be slowed, moderated, so they can trigger further splits in nearby uranium atoms. 2 materials could do this: graphite or heavy water, D2O. American and British scientists found that graphite worked if purified. But German chemists, using impure graphite samples, concluded it absorbed too many neutrons. That single miscalculation pushed them toward heavy water instead, a choice that doomed their atomic program. Heavy water is rare. Only 0.015% of natural hydrogen is deuterium. Producing it requires massive electrolysis of water to separate the heavier molecules. And in 1934, only one industrial site on Earth could do that efficiently: Norsk Hydro's Vemork plant in Telemark, Norway. Originally built in 1911 to generate fertilizer, it became the world's first large-scale heavy water production facility by accident of chemistry. Each year it produced only a few hundred kilograms, but for a nuclear reactor, that was enough. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, Wehrmacht officers immediately took over Norsk Hydro. Within weeks, shipments of heavy water began traveling by train to Berlin's Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where physicists like Werner Heisenberg and Kurt Diebner were attempting to assemble a prototype reactor. British intelligence monitoring Norwegian resistance reports soon realized the implications. MI6 decrypts and Norwegian informants confirmed it. The Nazis were buying every gram of heavy water they could find. In the fall of 1942, Allied intelligence estimated that if production continued uninterrupted, Germany could reach reactor criticality within a year. In London, the reaction was immediate. The Chiefs of Staff formed a joint committee between the SOE, Special Operations Executive, and Norwegian exiles to plan sabotage. Churchill's directive was blunt. The destruction of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant is of the highest priority. No effort must be spared. The Allies were already planning the Manhattan Project, but they knew their bomb was years away. If the Nazis succeeded first, the result could be catastrophic. A radiological weapon dropped on London, or a dirty bomb over Moscow. So an industrial site buried in snow became the single most important target in Europe that wasn't on the front lines. And it would take not an army, but a handful of men on skis to destroy it. Before the heroes of Operation Gunnerside, there was Operation Freshman, a plan born of desperation and doomed by weather, misfortune, and hubris. It was November 1942, 4 months before the successful raid. The Allies knew time was running out. Intelligence confirmed that Vemork's heavy water production had tripled since occupation, so Britain's Royal Engineers were ordered to do what commandos hadn't yet tried: fly in by glider, blow up the plant, and escape across Norway to Sweden. It was the first combined airborne glider raid in history. 2 Horsa gliders, each carrying 15 sappers and commandos, were hitched to Halifax bombers at RAF Skitton in Scotland. Each glider weighed 5 tons, loaded with explosives, skis, and survival gear. The plan? Fly 400 miles over the North Sea, cut loose above the Hardangervidda plateau, land on frozen ground near the Grouse reconnaissance team, and storm the plant. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was suicide. That night, hurricane-force winds hammered the Norwegian coast. The gliders iced over, tow cables snapped, and radio beacons failed. The first Halifax went down into a mountain near Helleland. The glider it towed smashed into the snow, killing all but a few men on impact. The second pair met the same fate minutes later. Some survivors stumbled from the wrecks, frostbitten, dazed, and weaponless. Locals tried to help them, but German patrols arrived first. The captured men were taken to Stavanger for interrogation, then transferred to Trondheim under the Gestapo. What happened next broke every convention of war. In October 1942, Adolf Hitler had signed the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order. It declared that any Allied commando, regardless of uniform or surrender, was to be executed immediately without trial. The freshman prisoners were beaten, tortured, and finally murdered. Some shot, others strangled with wire. 18 British soldiers vanished into shallow graves in the Norwegian snow. For the men of the SOE, it was a nightmare. The loss of both gliders, both bombers, and every man confirmed what skeptics had warned. A foreign team could not survive the terrain or the weather. Worse, the disaster alerted the Germans. They mined the roads to Vemork, reinforced bridges, added floodlights and guards, and posted anti-aircraft guns. London now faced a brutal equation. Another direct assault by air was impossible. A bomber strike risked killing hundreds of civilians in Ryukin and destroying Norway's hydroelectric grid. There was only one option left: send Norwegians, men who could blend in, ski 30 miles in a blizzard, and live off reindeer meat for weeks. So the British turned to the Norwegian section of the SOE and to a handful of elite resistance fighters already inside occupied territory. Among them, Joachim Roneberg, age 23, the man chosen to lead what would become Operation Gunnerside. With him were Knut Haugland, Kasper Idland, Fredrik Kaiser, Birger Stromsheim, and Trond Bolsa. All volunteers, all willing to die if it meant stopping the bomb. The freshman failure had taught them everything. Never depend on aircraft navigation, never plan an evacuation, and above all, expect no rescue. Their orders were clear. Link up with the surviving reconnaissance team codenamed Grouse, infiltrate Vemork on foot, destroy the heavy water chambers, and disappear. No contact with locals, no radio after insertion, no chance of extraction. The mission had shifted from a military operation to what Churchill later called a suicide act of science. The next time the Germans saw saboteurs in Telemark, they wouldn't come from the sky. They'd come gliding silently down the mountains on skis, invisible against the snow. High in southern Norway lies a desolate wilderness called the Hardangervidda Plateau, 3,000 square kilometers of frozen emptiness. No towns, no roads, just snowdrifts, boulders, and silence, broken only by wind howling over ice. In October 1942, 4 Norwegians had parachuted here, Operation Grouse, months before Gunnerside even existed. Their mission? Survive in the wilderness, gather intelligence, and prepare landing zones for the British gliders that never came. After Operation Freshman failed, those 4 men were stranded. No contact with London, no resupply. For months they lived inside a canvas hut buried in snow, surviving on moss, lichens, and an occasional reindeer shot with a stolen rifle. Their bodies froze during the night, frost forming on their beards as they huddled around a candle flame that barely gave light. They were Klaus Hellberg, Jens Anton Poulsen, Arne Schellstrup, and Knud Haugland. By February 1943, they had endured 120 days of near starvation and blizzards without breaking radio silence. They were still alive, but barely. On the night of February 16, 1943, the long-awaited reinforcements arrived. Operation Gunnerside. 6 new commandos parachuting from a Halifax bomber. They jumped at 8,000 feet into a swirling snowstorm. Visibility near zero, temperatures below -30. Their parachutes vanished into the white void. Most landed scattered miles apart. One of them, team leader Joachim Roneberg, later said, "When I hit the snow, the silence was total. I thought I was dead." For 2 days they searched blindly through the storm, dragging sleds full of explosives, rifles, and radios. They moved only by night, covering their tracks with branches to avoid Luftwaffe reconnaissance. Finally, on February 21, 1943, they saw smoke rising from a snowbank, the Grouse hideout. After 4 months of isolation, the original team had finally made contact with London again, through their brothers in arms. The reunion was emotional but brief. The men embraced, shared the last of their dried meat, and immediately began planning the raid. Roneberg, the youngest, now commanded 9 of the toughest men in Norway. For the first time, the SOE had what freshmen never did: local expertise, up-to-date intel, and a small, invisible strike force. They studied every detail of Vemork. The plant sat on a cliff above the Mona River, connected by a single narrow bridge. Floodlights covered the front gate. The rear side was thought impassable, a 200-meter-deep ravine. Inside were German guards, a few Norwegian workers, and a cable tunnel running under the plant to a railway line. That tunnel was the key. If they could reach it from the riverbed, they could bypass every guard and enter the basement directly beneath the electrolysis chambers. But to get there, they'd have to descend sheer cliffs, cross a half-frozen river, and climb an icy slope on the far side. All at night, in silence, carrying 30 kilograms of explosives. They drilled for a week, rehearsing every move, cutting wire, setting fuses, escaping uphill on skis. They ate rationed chocolate, dried meat, and a local delicacy, reindeer heart, for energy. They shaved beards to blend in if captured, and stitched British insignia onto their uniforms deliberately to prove they were soldiers, not partisans, in hopes of avoiding summary execution. On the morning of February 27th, final orders came through via coded radio from London. Proceed with operation. Destroy plant. Godspeed. That night, the team left their mountain hut for the last time. Each man carried cyanide capsules in his pocket, a final insurance against capture. They skied 30 miles through blizzards and ice fields until the lights of the Vemork plant shimmered below them, a fortress glowing against the dark valley. Steam hissed from the pipes. Searchlights swept the snow. Beyond that ravine was the German atomic dream, and the heart of Hitler's most secret weapon. The Norwegians dug their skis into the snow, took out their compasses, and began descending into the abyss. The plan hinged on one brutal fact. The rear of Vemork was built above a 200-meter ravine. From below, the plant looked impregnable. From above, it was a fortress. But under the plant ran a narrow cable tunnel, a maintenance passage that connected to the railway on the far side. If the saboteurs could reach that tunnel from the riverbed, they could walk straight into the heart of the plant and place charges beneath the electrolysis cells. At 23:30 on February 27, 1943, 5 men, Runeberg, Haugland, Knut Haukelid, alias Casper Idland, and Birger Stromsheim, set out from the grouse hut toward the ravine. 2 others remained behind to cover the escape route and act as lookouts. They moved in single file, skis silent, faces masked with scarves. Each man carried a sled weighed down with specially designed explosive charges, plastic explosives in waterproof tins, fuse cord, detonators, and a simple trigger mechanism. They had brought 18 charges in total. The goal was to disable the heavy water electrolysis cells long enough to render them inoperable and destroy the associated piping and pumps. Each charge was wrapped in oilcloth and hidden under reindeer hides to keep them from freezing. Their descent into the ravine was the most dangerous part. The path was a vertical scramble of frozen rock and snow, where one slip meant falling into a white abyss. At a point called the cableway access, they tied themselves together with climbing rope and lowered each other down by hand. Runeberg later described the descent as a ladder that led to hell. The cold bit through leather gloves. Breath crystallized on eyelashes. At the base, they reached the river Mana, a black ribbon of water cutting through ice. The men stripped heavy outer garments, waded waist-deep in numbing water, and climbed the opposite bank. Their boots clung with ice. Fingers went numb. One operative later said the water felt like 1,000 knives. They arrived at the railway tunnel entrance under the plant at 1 o'clock. The Germans had built a heavy iron door and a set of sluice gates to prevent tampering. The saboteurs worked in total silence. Idland used improvised tools to pry open the ironwork, while Haugland kept watch through a narrow crack for patrols or searchlights. The one guard on that side was asleep in a hut some distance away, a stroke of luck the men did not risk. Once inside the cable tunnel, the world changed. The space was low and dim. Water dripped from rivets. They moved crouched, slipping on oil and grease, pushing sleds along on ropes. The tunnel surfed the plant's underbelly until they reached the chamber directly beneath the electrolysis cells, a room of noisy pumps and towering metal vats where water was electrolyzed to concentrate deuterium. Here, the saboteurs faced a technical decision. Direct hits on cells could be repaired. Destroying pumps, control valves, and connecting piping would cause longer delays. The team split. 2 men would fit charges to the base of the cells. 4 would take out pumps and piping. Each charge was placed with precision, under an anode support beam, wrapped against metal, and wired into a single detonation chain meant to go off at once. They used a simple but effective fuse setup. The detonators employed time fuses, lengths of safety fuse calculated to burn for a set interval, connected to primers pressed into the explosive tins. The team tested lengths of burnt fuse during rehearsal in the hut to ensure a reliable delay, accounting for damp conditions and low temperatures that could slow burning rates. One miscalculation could mean either immediate discovery or charges that never detonate. At 1:15, the men set the final timers. They tied themselves together and began the escape up the cable tunnel toward the river mouth. Every creak sounded like boots. Every footfall could be a guard's patrol returning early. The plan required absolute speed. Their route back climbed steep stairs and a ladder that rose 20 meters into the cold night. They moved in silence, breath shallow, lungs burning from the cold and exertion. Just as they reached the ladder exit, a single muffled thud rolled through the tunnel. The charges detonated. The explosion was surgical. It ripped through metal, blew out sections of the electrolysis chambers, and shattered glass and control gauges. The plant's internal piping ruptured. Pumps were wrecked and shorted by flying debris. In the control room above, alarms screamed and searchlights stabbed the skies. But in the chaos, the saboteurs were ghosts. They had timed their exit to a narrow window, long enough to be gone before guards could form a coherent response, short enough that the initial search would look toward the obvious approaches, not the river ravine. As they climbed back up the ravine, the team split into prearranged routes. Ronneberg led one pair toward the west ridgeline, a path so steep it was judged impassable. The Germans assumed no man could cross there. Another pair climbed to a higher plateau and began skiing east. They had planted 30 minutes of misdirection, leaving a stolen Thompson submachine gun and British equipment in a visible area near the plant to suggest a conventional British commando assault. That choice was deliberate. Show evidence of foreign involvement to deflect suspicion away from local resistance and to spare Norwegian workers reprisals. Within minutes, the valley erupted. Floodlights threw long needles of light. Sentries fired tracer rounds. Dogs howled. German units streamed from barracks. Spotters scanned with binoculars. Yet the false trail and the choice to exit by the ravine slowed coherent pursuit. For hours, search parties combed the wrong slopes and roads. The saboteurs converged at preset ration caches, hollowed out cairns with sealed tins of pemmican and spare clothing. They dried socks by a small, concealed metal stove, changed into dry mittens, and buried their spent fuse remnants in the snow. One operative, exhausted, collapsed beside a cairn and vomited blood from the exertion and cold. Another, with frost-bitten toes, bound them with a strip of leather. No one spoke. Survival occupied every mind. Crucially, the raid did not kill civilians. The team designed the charges to avoid large secondary blasts that could collapse the whole structure and risked killing Norwegian workers who lived nearby. It was a targeted industrial sabotage, engineered to be effective but limited in collateral damage. By dawn, the German response hardened. Artillery was brought forward. Anti-aircraft batteries swept the skies. Aircraft conducted low passes, dropping leaflets ordering workers to remain at home. But by then, the saboteurs had vanished into a white wilderness that even the enemy feared. The plant would not resume full production for months. Pipes had to be replaced, electrodes reassembled, pumps reordered from Germany. The Allies had achieved a strategic delay measured in months, a window the Manhattan Project used. And in the immediate aftermath, the Germans poured forces into the plateau like water into a pothole. 4,000 troops were mobilized, searching every snowbank and abandoned hut. Bounties were increased. Sled dogs pulled patrols for days. Yet the saboteurs slipped like ghosts across the land. The explosions at Vemork were still echoing through the valley when the German garrison mobilized. By 2 a.m., the alarm had reached Oslo. By dawn, 4,000 troops from the Wehrmacht and SS Polizei were sweeping the Hardangervidda plateau. They had orders to capture or kill every saboteur, and to shoot any civilian suspected of helping them. The Norwegian saboteurs, exhausted and half-frozen, were already moving. Ronneberg's group, 5 men, turned west, heading for the mountains toward Sogn-og-Fjordane, more than 400 kilometers away. The rest, Haugland, Poulsen, and Kjelstrup, remained behind to continue resistance work, operating radios for the SOE under new code names. Their escape would become legend, a feat of endurance unmatched in the war. They moved entirely on skis, each pulling a 20-kilogram sled through snowdrifts that reached their waists. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Winds howled across the plateau, and frostbite set in within hours. They traveled only by night, sleeping by day in snow caves they dug with shovels, wrapping themselves in reindeer skins for warmth. They carried no radios now. Silence was survival. Every few hours they stopped to rub limbs, check weapons, and eat rationed slices of dried reindeer heart, their only food. One man's boots froze so solid that he had to thaw them by holding them over his own body heat for hours inside the snow cave. Behind them, the Germans advanced with dogs, skis, and aircraft. Patrols scoured every farm and cabin in Telemark. Leaflets offered 100,000 kroner for information. But in a twist of irony, many German units refused to chase into the high plateau. Locals called it the White Hell. The saboteurs crossed that hell for 14 days. They covered 400 kilometers, an Olympic-level ski journey while hunted, starving, and half-blind from snow glare. At one point, a storm buried their trail so completely that they hid under the snow for 36 hours, unable to light a fire or move. Runeberg later recalled, "It was a grave we had to lie in and hope the storm became our ally." By March 10th, they reached the Swedish border near Tinnsjö Lake. They crossed into neutral territory unnoticed, thin, frostbitten, but alive. A Swedish border patrol, shocked at their condition, escorted them to a local hospital where doctors recorded extreme exhaustion and exposure, but no casualties. They had accomplished the impossible, destroyed the heavy water plant, evaded 4,000 enemy soldiers, and reached freedom without firing a single shot in combat. The men's first request in Sweden wasn't for medals or recognition. It was for a bath and a meal. When food arrived, potatoes, butter, and bread, they fell silent and wept. Runeberg would later tell historians, "It was not courage that saved us. It was friendship. When one fell, the others lifted him." Back in Norway, German frustration turned to fury. Local workers were interrogated, but none betrayed the resistance. The Gestapo burned cabins and arrested suspected collaborators, but found nothing. The Vemork facility itself was crippled. The heavy water tanks had been ruptured, critical piping destroyed, and the plant's power systems damaged beyond easy repair. Production halted for months. In Berlin, physicist Werner Heisenberg received the news with disbelief. He told colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, "It seems the Norwegians have decided the fate of physics in Germany." In London, the SOE received confirmation from coded resistance channels. Hydro plant destroyed. Team safe in Sweden. Churchill's staff marked the report with one word: marvelous. And in secret, the Allied scientific community sighed in relief. The German atomic clock had been turned back by 6 young men on skis. The Germans refused to accept defeat. Within days of the Gunnerside explosion, engineers from Berlin arrived at Vemork to assess the damage. They found the electrolysis hall wrecked, valves blown out, and heavy water storage drums shattered. But key foundations were intact. By May 1943, the plant's production lines were being rebuilt under tighter security. Extra floodlights, tripwires, new guards from the Wehrmacht's 268th Infantry Division. The occupation authorities ordered replacement electrolytic cells from Germany. By August, the first trickle of heavy water began again. British intelligence, reading intercepted radio traffic, realized the victory was only temporary. They debated a second commando raid, but decided another ground operation was impossible. The Germans were alert. The element of surprise was gone. So London chose a blunt instrument: strategic bombing. On November 16, 1943, 161 American bombers from the 8th Air Force roared over Telemark. They dropped nearly 700 bombs on Ryukon Valley. The result? Most of the town was flattened. But the Vemork plant itself, buried deep in rock, survived. Only 18 bombs actually hit the facility. The hydroelectric power station was damaged but still functional. 22 Norwegian civilians were killed. The raid hurt morale, but not production. In Berlin, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, ordered the heavy water stockpiles evacuated to Germany for safekeeping. The operation would be supervised by Major Sonder of the Wehrmacht, using the SF Hydro, a 53-meter ferry that crossed Lake Tinnsjö between Ryukon and Tinneset. If successful, it would move the last 500 liters of heavy water and the most critical reactor components to Germany for final experiments. But Norwegian intelligence was listening. Agents embedded at Norsk Hydro radioed London. Germans intend to transport heavy water drums by ferry hydro on the 20th of February 1944. Within hours, the SOE gave a green light for one final act of sabotage. A small resistance cell led by Knut Haukelid, a veteran of the Gunnerside team who had stayed behind in Norway, slipped aboard the SF Hydro the night before departure. Working in the dark, Haukelid and his men attached plastic explosives to the keel supports beneath the cargo deck, directly under the railway wagons carrying the heavy water barrels. The charges were set on a time fuse to detonate mid-lake, guaranteeing total loss of the shipment, but minimizing civilian casualties near shore. At 10:45 a.m., February 20th, 1944, the ferry departed. 39 people were on board: German soldiers, railway workers, and Norwegian civilians. 20 minutes later, in the center of Lake Tinja, a muffled blast tore through the hull. The ship listed sharply, water flooding in through the cargo deck. Within seconds, the SF Hydro rolled and sank into 430 meters of icy water, taking the heavy water barrels to the bottom of the lake. 14 Norwegians and 4 Germans drowned. 29 survived, pulled from the freezing lake by local fishermen. The saboteurs had watched from the cliffs, counting seconds between detonation and sinking, knowing what that explosion meant. Haukelid radioed London 2 words: shipment destroyed. It was the end of Germany's heavy water supply, and with it, the end of any realistic path to a Nazi atomic bomb. By late 1944, Heisenberg's team in Haigerloch was reduced to assembling a small experimental reactor using only a fraction of the heavy water they once had. When Allied troops captured the site in April 1945, they found primitive equipment, handwritten notebooks, and a reactor that had never gone critical. The German atomic program had collapsed not by science, but by sabotage. The long war for the bomb was over. When the smoke cleared and Europe finally drew breath, the world learned what had truly happened on those Norwegian mountains. For 2 years, the details of Operation Gunnerside remained top secret. The men had returned to Britain quietly. Even their families were told only that they were safe. But in 1945, with Germany defeated and Allied investigators sifting through the wreckage of Hitler's scientific empire, the truth emerged. At the captured Haigerloch reactor site, Allied scientific officers of Operation Alsos found crude graphite shielding, 664 uranium cubes, and barely a few dozen liters of heavy water. The reactor had never gone critical. Without Vemork's supply, the Germans had been stuck at the threshold of a working chain reaction. The report concluded simply: German atomic research was hindered primarily by shortage of heavy water. That shortage was not an accident of logistics. It was the direct result of 9 Norwegians on skis. Joachim Runeberg returned to Ålesund after the war, refusing hero worship. He became a journalist, lived quietly, and seldom spoke of the raid until his 80s. When asked what he felt, he said, "We did a job, nothing more." War is not about medals. It's about preventing worse things from happening. Knut Haugland joined Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki expedition years later, crossing the Pacific on a balsa raft. Others went back to ordinary lives: teachers, engineers, shopkeepers. None sought fame. In 1948, the group received Norway's highest decoration, the Krigskorset Medsverd, War Cross with Sword. The British awarded Runeberg the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross. The SOE archives list Gunnerside as the most successful single act of sabotage in the Second World War. Even decades later, historians debated the cost. 18 civilians had died in the 1943 bombing of Rjukan. 14 Norwegians drowned on the ferry Hydro. Was it worth it? Most Norwegians, and many Germans, later agreed it was. Those deaths, tragic as they were, prevented the far greater horror of a nuclear-armed Reich. The saboteurs themselves carried the burden quietly. Runeberg told students in 2015, aged 95, "War is the failure of everything else. Never forget what it takes to stop evil once it has begun." Operation Gunnerside was more than a raid. It was a demonstration that science and courage are both double-edged. The same physics that could destroy the world could also be defended by men with nothing but rope, skis, and will. It reshaped Allied thinking about special operations. The precision, local recruitment, and deep terrain infiltration became the model for modern special forces doctrine. From Britain's SAS to Norway's Forsvarets Spesialkommando, it also forged a moral precedent: the right and necessity to strike preemptively against weapons of mass destruction, a principle that would echo through the Cold War. Today, the Vemork plant stands silent. Inside the old turbine hall, visitors can still see the twisted pipes and mock-ups of the charges used that night. On a plaque by the entrance are the names of the saboteurs, followed by a simple inscription: "They crossed the mountains so that light could return to Europe." The Allied nuclear race would continue in secrecy, leading eventually to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the world entered that atomic age one step safer, because 6 young Norwegians had already proved that knowledge alone doesn't decide history. Courage does. If you found this story of science, sabotage, and survival worth remembering, subscribe to WW2 Declassified.